Was I wrong about the Silmarillion's half-elven king? Did I fail to capture the full complexity of his character? Well, let's take a look. This is Dior Eluchil, revisited. Maya, Govan and Melanine, and welcome to this special little bonus episode to tie up our Silmaril of Doriath First Age series. This honestly wasn't an episode I was intending to make, but after releasing the finale last week, I saw a couple of comments along the same lines that got me rethinking one of the points I made in it. Some people have suggested I was wrong about Dior Eluchil. I was wrong to defend his decision not to surrender the Silmaril, and I was wrong to propose he had the moral high ground during the second kinslaying. To be honest, I wasn't really expecting this feedback, and I'm still not sure to what extent my mind's being changed by it, but I do think there's an interesting line of consideration to follow here, and it's led me to a few new conclusions. The point of this bonus episode is not to take back or unsay any of what I put forward in the last episode. I just think there's an opportunity here to eke out a little bit more nuance. So, I guess my first point to make, in the last episode, I may have slightly understated the part that pride played in Dior's decision-making. I don't want to oversteer my course correction here. Some Middle-earth characters are absolutely defined by their pride, and I do not think Dior is one of them. But in the Silmarillion, it is written that the sons of Feanor, upon hearing of the renewal of Doriath and of Dior's pride, gathered again and made their claim known. That is the only explicit reference to Dior's pride in any of Tolkien's writings. It's not at the core of his character, but it is clearly present. He didn't have to clasp the Silmaril around his own neck when he inherited it from his parents. He could have kept it safe and secret. Instead, he wore it, and he appeared as the fairest of all the children of the world, which is, I think, an understandable thing to want, but, in hindsight, also a mistake. To compare Dior to another character, who, as much as I enjoy Dior, is clearly the better character, in The Lord of the Rings, we meet Faramir, and he has a conversation with Frodo about Isildur's mysterious bane. He doesn't know its true nature, he does not know that what they're talking about is the One Ring, but he guesses. Whatever Frodo's carrying, it was a cause of conflict between him and the other members of the Fellowship. He says to Frodo, "I can well believe that Boromir, the proud and fearless, often rash, ever anxious for the victory of Minas Tirith and his own glory therein, might desire such a thing and be allured by it. But fear no more. I would not take this thing if it lay by the highway, not if Minas Tirith were falling in ruin and I alone could save her so." I bring this up because I love Boromir, and I love Faramir, but it seems pretty irrefutable. Faramir passes a test here that Boromir didn't. And I suppose one could argue Dior's decision-making in the First Age is certainly closer to Boromir's than it is to Faramir's. You know, Dior, the proud and fearless, often rash, ever anxious for the victory of Doriath, did desire such a thing and was allured by it. If Melian was still around, I don't think it's controversial to suggest she would have advised her grandson the same way she advised her husband, Eluthingol. Surrender the bloody Silmaril. And in my mind, this is probably the most compelling argument against what I made the case for last time. Obviously, Melian loved her grandson. Obviously, she cared greatly about Beren and Luthien's quest to get a Silmaril. Obviously, she would have wanted only what's best for New Doriath and its people, and obviously, she would have told her grandson to let the jewel go. It just isn't worth holding on to. If Dior were operating with that level of wisdom, I do think he would have made a different decision. Anyway, I suppose the most obvious character to compare Dior with while he was making this decision would be his late grandfather, Eluchil. 38 years before the Second Kinslaying, the Sons of Feanor sent word to Thingol himself, summoning him to yield the Silmaril or become their enemy. Melian counselled him just surrender it like a normal person, but the Sons of Feanor were proud and threatening, and Thingol was filled with anger, thinking of the anguish of Luthien and the blood of Beren whereby the jewel had been won, despite the malice of Celegorm and Curafin. And every day that he looked upon the Silmaril, the more he desired to keep it forever, for such was its power. If we swap the word Thingol with Dior, that sentence still makes perfect sense 2 chapters and 38 years later within his story. And there's another detail that I possibly should have done a better job emphasizing in previous episodes. When Dior first acquires the Silmaril, Tolkien gives us one of those very interesting lines where we are told, "The wise have said that the Silmaril hastened Beren and Luthien's end, for the flame of the beauty of Luthien as she wore it was too bright for mortal lands. The Silmaril shines with such intensity that mortals cannot bear it. The light of the Undying Lands is so potent, a mortal spirit will be burned up by it and their death accelerated. Their life will be blissful, but it will be short. It's one of the Legendarium's most bittersweet details." And it means if Dior and his descendants are counted as mortals, their Silmaril is destined to drastically reduce their lifespans. It would be a real poisoned chalice. Later in the Silmarillion, we are told if mortals were ever to behold the light of the Undying Lands for any length of time, they would but wither and grow weary the sooner, as moths in a light too strong and steadfast. This isn't really relevant if Dior and his descendants are counted as immortals, and as I've explained, we have compelling evidence for both possibilities, although the fact that Dior is able to touch the jewel without being burned by it does actually suggest that he is an immortal. But either way, this fact kinda recontextualizes how we might imagine the fate of the dwarves from earlier in this story. Even if things had gone differently, if they had made it past Beren and gotten home safely to Nogrod, they would have become mortal people living within the light of the Undying West. It's counterfactual, so we can't say anything for certain, but I believe a Silmaril in the Blue Mountains would have hastened the dwarves' end. Its flame would have shone too bright for their Fear to endure. I imagine they would have lived in utter bliss for a little while, but within a couple of years, perhaps, Nogrod would have been bright, beautiful, and dead. There is an esteemed Tolkien professor called Dr. Verlin Flieger who I think hits the nail on the head when it comes to describing exactly what the Silmarils are and what they represent in Tolkien's story. In her first book, which is called Splintered Light, she wrote, "As artifacts, the Silmarils embody light as a physical reality, tangible matter that can be touched, handled, and worked. As jewels, they are a metaphor for the desire of humankind for beauty and for the negative of this desire: possessiveness, covetousness, selfishness, and lust. Since the light of the Silmarils is enclosed in jewels, it does not necessarily shine for all and on all, as does the light of the trees from which it comes. It can be owned, possessed by a single individual to the exclusion of all others. It can be held in the hand, worn as an ornament, or hidden away at the owner's whim." I think one of the key words here is desire. Dior is, I believe, a fundamentally good person, but it seems impossible to argue he doesn't desire the light of the Silmaril. And this emphasis on desire instantly makes my mind turn to the next great artifact of the Second and Third Ages, the One Ring. I've already made a whole video about the One Ring and how it works, but if I were to boil those 35 minutes down into one word, that word would be desire. That's how it corrupts, by latching onto a person's desire. Even really hard to corrupt characters like Sam Gamgee, upon acquiring the ring for himself, experiences visions of becoming Samwise the Strong and dominating all of Mordor with his desire to turn it into his own great green garden. The one character who doesn't seem to have any desire whatsoever, Tom Bombadil, is the one character who is seemingly immune to the One Ring's influence. And although, obviously, Sauron's ring is, in many ways, very different from Feanor's jewel, I do think there are some interesting parallels between how different First Age characters behave when they are exposed to it, and how their Second and Third Age counterparts behave around the One Ring. As an example, let's take a look at Dior's grandfather, Eluchil. He desired the Silmaril really quite possessively. A few pages before Dior's story begins in chapter 22, we are told, as the years passed, Thingol's thought turned unceasingly to the jewel of Feanor and became bound to it, and he liked not to let it rest even behind the doors of his inmost treasury, and he was minded now to bear it with him always, waking and sleeping. Now, read that sentence again, but this time replace the word Thingol with Smeagol, and the Jewel of Feanor with the ring. Apart from the fact that I don't think Smeagol's inmost treasury ever had doors, the rest of that still makes perfect sense, right? I'm not saying Thingol is like Gollum, I'm just saying they both desire their respective jewellery with quite some intensity. Conversely, we could also perhaps draw parallels between Beren's relationship with the Silmaril and Bilbo Baggins's relationship with the One Ring. In both their cases, it wasn't desire for the treasure that motivated them. Beren went to Angband as an act of love, to earn a lifetime of marriage with Luthien, and she went with him for the same reason. They both had Ilúvatar on their side as they took possession of the jewel. Similarly, when Bilbo takes possession of the One Ring, he does so with an act of pity. He has no desire to master it, and once again, Ilúvatar is paying attention. This sinister treasure is meant to pass to our unlikely hero. That is how we get to our eventual eucatastrophe. It might then follow that we could also compare Dior with Frodo. They are the two heirs by whom their respective artifacts are eventually inherited. But this is where my opinion has recently slightly shifted. I actually don't think Dior is that much like Frodo. Frodo never claimed the ring as his own until the very end. He was, until then, always just its bearer, carrying it away on a quest to be rid of it. But Dior doesn't get rid of the Silmaril, that's why we're talking about him. If you'd asked me even just a few days ago, I think I might have placed Dior Eluchil alongside heroes such as Aragorn or Faramir. You know, morally impeccable men who would not take this thing even if it lay by the highway. But I think the evidence suggests Dior probably would take the Silmaril if it lay by the highway, and he probably would hold onto it and try to use it in the pursuit of glorious victory. He would justify his decision in all kinds of compelling ways, I'm sure, but he would not reach the standard of Faramir or Aragorn. My perspective has changed. I am now thinking Dior might fit better among heroes like Boromir or Isildur. Great men who fought valiantly and resisted evil and loved their homelands and achieved epic deeds, but were also undone, because they desired too deeply that which is beautiful, and they died because of it. I must stress emphatically that I think both Boromir and Isildur are excellent characters, and comparing Dior to either of them should be in no way seen as disparaging. I very much enjoy all three of these guys. But I do think they are different from the likes of, Aragorn, or Beren, or Bilbo, or Frodo. I think there's potentially a lot more nuance to be found in Dior than what I talked about in the last episode. Anyway, before finishing this, I want to take a couple of moments to speculate on what Dior maybe should have done instead. Surrender the Silmaril is what I hear some of you shouting, and yes, alright, that is what Melian said too. But before I get to that, I first have another idea for how Dior might have responded to the Sons of Feanor without just saying straight up no. I'm not saying he should have done this, but wouldn't it have been interesting if Dior did what his grandfather did? What if he had said to the Sons of Feanor, you know what, you can have what you want, but first, you gotta earn it by going on a quest into Angband? What if he had promised to hand over the Silmaril if the brothers snuck into Angband and reclaimed another one? Ideally both. Mightn't Dior have been in a much stronger position? I doubt Celegorm or Curufin would have ever been tempted to do a decent thing, but Maedhros and Maglor might have at least tried sneaking into Angband rather than attacking Doriath. The Feanorians might have been split. It might have weakened Celegorm and Curufin's fighting force, and it might have got a few Sons of Feanor killed in Angband. Or it might have got the other two Silmarils out. If the Sons of Feanor could successfully take twice as many Silmarils from Morgoth as Beren and Luthien did, I think most people, even the most anti-Feanor people, would agree, you know what, fair enough, Beren and Luthien's son should freely surrender the other one. No kinslaying required. Wouldn't it have been interesting if Dior had tried channeling his grandfather's thought process into playing that card instead of simply refusing to engage? Who knows what might have happened? Anyway, as we know, he did not play that card. Instead, he passed the Silmaril on to his daughter, and then he died, violently, along with much of his kingdom. So, what might have happened if he hadn't? What if he'd done what Grandma Melian surely would have advised? What if he'd done a Frodo or a Faramir and just let it go? Obviously, we cannot know, but I think there are a couple of possible trajectories. Firstly, we know that no evil hand may ever touch a Silmaril without being burned. So I suppose the operative question becomes, if the Sons of Feanor never performed the second kinslaying, would they be morally righteous enough not to be burned? This is subjective, all people are free to disagree, but I would argue absolutely not in the case of Celegorm and Curufin. Those two were morally rotten before Dior was even born. The other brothers, though? Hard to say. All of them did partake in the first kinslaying, so they're not exactly morally pure, but I would argue at Alqualonde, Feanor was more culpable than his sons were, so maybe if Dior had handed the Silmaril over to Maedhros or Maglor, or Amras, or even Caranthir, perhaps the hallowed jewel would have, quote-unquote, let them bear it. If this were the case, I imagine we would very swiftly see an enormous divide form among the brothers. If Celegorm and Curufin realized they are not able to touch their father's jewel without suffering agony, I think it would probably drive them into some kind of homicidal rage. It would also cement Maedhros as the true heir of Feanor. But the rest of the brothers would then face another tricky situation. With one Silmaril under their belt, the nature of their oath would presumably change. You know, there's no way to fulfill it by attacking innocent elves anymore. The only way forward would be entering Angband. It seems to me highly unlikely that the sons would have succeeded in doing what Beren and Luthien did, but it also seems unlikely that they would have let anyone else take possession of the Silmaril while they were trying. Maybe they would have left it behind with Amaras, the youngest, but I don't see any version of events where the rest of the brothers survive the next step of their oath. I think the likeliest options are either Morgoth reclaims their Silmaril and all three end up once again trapped inside the Dark Lord's crown, which would make Beren and Luthien's quest completely pointless, or most of the sons are killed and their last survivor runs away with the Silmaril, becomes bound to it, and never manages to fulfill his oath of taking the other two. Either way, I just don't think it could have ended well for the Sons of Feanor. We can argue it would have ended better for Doriath if the second kinslaying never happened, not gonna disagree with that. But once again, I don't think we'd ever get this hypothetical to any kind of happy ending. Doriath has no defense now against the rising tide of Angband. Its ruin really does seem only a matter of time. Yes, if Dior surrendered the Silmaril, Doriath definitely would have lasted longer, but it would not, I don't think, have lasted. Because, speaking of a happy ending, I don't want to spoil things for people who don't already know the Silmarillion, but even if you are one of those people, I'm guessing you have already heard of the Light of Eärendil. Even if you don't know what it is, I'm guessing you know that in The Lord of the Rings, when Frodo is faced with the darkness of Shelob's lair, he will raise his starglass and say the words, Aya Eärendil, Elenion and Kalimar. Hail Eärendil, the brightest of stars. The story right now seems about as bleak as possible, but there is a light coming. That light has to get to a guy called Eärendil, and the way that that is going to happen is because of Dior's decision. Doriath has to fall for us to reach our eucatastrophe, our cataclysmic happy ending, the climax of the First Age. I am willing to admit Dior did make mistakes. He may have even failed tests. But just like, for example, Boromir, and just like Isildur, and just like every other character in the Legendarium, ultimately Dior proves himself but Ilúvatar's instrument, in the devising of things more wonderful that he himself hath not imagined. If Boromir hadn't tried to take the ring from Frodo, certainly things would have been different. Boromir would have made a better decision. But Frodo would not have broken from the Fellowship when he did. He might have never gotten away. All could have been lost. If Dior hadn't refused to surrender the Silmaril, things would have been different too. More people in Doriath would have survived, but the Silmaril would not have come to the havens of Sirion at the time that it did. Its light might never have found Eärendil. All could have been lost. Like all of Tolkien's heroes, Dior uses his free will to make his own decisions. But just like all of Tolkien's characters, he ends up proving himself Ilúvatar's instrument all the same. That is one of the most fundamental points, I think, of Tolkien's entire Legendarium. So, although I do concede Dior may not be as without fault as I maybe implied in the last episode, and there might be a degree of complexity that I oughtn't have left out, I do maintain the second King of Doriath is an excellent guy, and his contribution to the Elder Days remains as rich as it is fleeting. But I guess the point of this bonus episode is that it might be more appropriate to think of him as being closer to like a First Age Boromir or a First Age Isildur, rather than a First Age Aragorn, like his father. I will leave that speculation up to you. Anyway, do you think Dior should be blamed for not surrendering the Silmaril, or was he right to do what he did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and thank you all very much for checking out this extra little bonus episode. You can now support the channel on Patreon or Ko-fi if you'd like to, so follow the links in the description to those pages if you are at all interested, and don't forget to like and subscribe to make sure you don't miss any future episodes coming soon. However, that actually is the end of this Silmaril of Doriath series this time, so until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevair Melanin.